The darkness of the night seeped through the grand library windows, crawling over the ancient books that lined the shelves, whispering secrets long buried. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows, making the room feel alive, watching, waiting. And then, do you really think this will stay hidden forever? A breath caught in a throat. The soft creak of a chair, and then a gunshot shattered the silence, echoing off the library's towering walls. The one who had survived that night by staying silent has now returned, ready to bring the truth to light. But the real question is, will the truth save them, or will another body fall upon this cursed floor? In the dead of night, only one thing is certain: secrets never stay buried, and when they rise, they bring nothing but destruction. The sun draped the countryside in a golden warmth, the scent of overripe roses mingling with the sharp tang of freshly cut grass. Bees hovered lazily over the garden, their hum a low, drowsy murmur that matched the tranquil facade of the afternoon. But tranquility was always a deception, and Agatha Marlowe knew it well. She sat in her wicker chair, knitting needles clicking with a steady precision, her tea forgotten and cooling beside her. Agatha was not the sort to miss details. She saw things others did not, the delicate shifts in expressions, the hesitation behind words, the careful rearranging of the world to hide its fractures. It wasn't a skill, it was a curse that tingled at the edges of her awareness, the moment the postman's familiar shuffle broke the hush of her garden. "Afternoon, Miss Marlowe," Henry said, his ink-stained fingers fumbling as he handed her a letter. The envelope was thick, the paper expensive, the kind that carried both weight and intention. She turned it over, feeling the smoothness beneath her fingertips before sliding a nail under the wax seal. The scent of faintly perfumed parchment rose as she unfolded the letter. "My dearest Agatha, it has been far too long. I find myself in need of an old friend. Please, come spend the weekend at Meadow Bank Hall. It would be a great kindness. Your presence, I feel, will be most reassuring. Yours, Helena." Reassuring. Agatha tapped the letter against her knee, her keen mind unraveling the subtext hidden between the lines. There was a tremor in Helena's words, a plea masked as an invitation. It was not idle loneliness or mere sentimentality that had prompted this letter. It was something else. And when a woman like Lady Helena Fairchild sought reassurance, it meant trouble had already arrived. A breeze rattled the hydrangeas, sending a ripple through the garden. Agatha took a sip of her tea. Cold, she sighed and set the cup down. Trouble had sent for her, and who was she to ignore such a promising summons? Packing was swift: 2 dresses, a sensible hat, sturdy shoes. Fashion was of little consequence when one was walking into uncertainty. As she fastened her small travel bag, Mrs. Davies, her housekeeper, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over her apron. "Meadow Bank, is it?" she asked, her tone flat. Agatha merely lifted a brow. "You disapprove." "I don't meddle, Miss Marlowe," Mrs. Davies said, wiping at a non-existent stain. "But places like that, stories stick to them." "Stories, whispers, miss, things folk don't speak of in polite company. You know the sort." Agatha smiled, slipping her gloves into her handbag. "Then it's fortunate I've never been particularly polite." She stepped out into the sunlight, where a carriage waited at the gate. The young driver barely looked old enough to shave, but he tipped his cap with practiced ease. "Miss Marlowe, I'm sent from Meadow Bank. How considerate of Lady Helena," she murmured, stepping into the carriage. The door clicked shut, sealing her inside as the wheels creaked forward over the gravel path. Outside, the countryside unfurled in rolling greens and tangled hedgerows, but Agatha paid little attention to the scenery. Her mind had already drifted ahead, to Meadow Bank Hall, to Helena's letter, to the unanswered questions tangled in those carefully chosen words. The journey was smooth, but as they rolled up the drive, the house loomed into view, its grandeur stark against the sinking sun. Meadowbank Hall was not a house built by men who entertained doubt. It was a fortress of wealth and history, its stone facade bearing the weight of generations. Its great oak doors stood tall, capable of swallowing secrets whole. A row of hedge walls lined the entrance, their perfection almost Money whispered here, it did not boast, and somewhere in its halls beneath its polished veneer, something was very, very wrong. As the carriage stilled, the estate stirred. Footmen stood at the entrance, one adjusting his gloves with idle boredom. Nearby, a young maid rushed across the path, silver tray trembling in her hands, urgency lining her every step. Agatha stepped down with the grace of a woman who had long learned how to move unseen in rooms where she did not belong. At the bottom of the steps, Captain Leonard Winslow waited, his posture stiff, his uniform too crisp for leisure. His was the stance of a man who had once commanded authority, but now found himself playing a different game. "Miss Marlowe," he said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Meadow Bank." She offered a polite smile, letting him take her bag. "How chivalrous," she murmured as they ascended the steps. Winslow's lips twitched, almost amused. "Chivalry is about all we have left, Miss Marlowe." But Agatha suspected that in the halls beyond, chivalry was not nearly enough. The air inside Blackthorn Manor was thick with the scent of old wood, and something fainter, something lingering beneath the polish, like a whisper of damp stone locked away too long. Eleanor Graves stepped through the grand entrance, her heels tapping lightly against the marble, her gaze sweeping across the vaulted ceiling, where a chandelier, monstrous in its opulence, scattered fractured light across the polished floor. Lord Ambrose Blackwood stood at the top of the staircase, a man carved from shadow and old money, his smile as thin as the dagger clasped in his family's crest. "Miss Graves," he murmured, voice silken with something unriddable, "how fortunate we are to have you." Eleanor tipped her head, not missing the briefest flicker of unease that tightened his jaw before he masked it. "Fortunate indeed," she replied smoothly, though the invitation she had received had carried the weight of something more than mere hospitality. As he descended, his polished shoes making no sound, she noticed the way the staff moved, precise, distant, their eyes averted as though trained not to linger on anything too long. A butler swept forward, taking her coat with the efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with things better left unspoken. The air shifted, a cold breath curling through the hall, despite the fire roaring in the grand hearth. Somewhere, beyond the carved oak doors of the study, a clock ticked slow and deliberate, as if measuring something more than time. A woman appeared then, gliding toward them with the practiced grace of someone who had learned long ago how to exist without truly being seen. Isabella Blackwood, Ambrose's sister, a porcelain figure wrapped in sapphire silk, her gaze flicking toward Eleanor with an intensity that belied the easy smile on her lips. "You arrived safely," she said, and there was something in her tone, relief or warning. Eleanor couldn't yet tell. "Blackthorn has been expecting you." The words hung delicate and deliberate, and Eleanor felt the weight of them settle in her chest. Outside, the wind howled through the maze of hedges that bordered the estate, rustling like whispered secrets, like footsteps where none should be. A flicker of movement beyond the window caught her eye, a figure standing just beyond the lantern's glow, watching, waiting, and just as quickly as she noticed, they were gone, swallowed by the dark. The hush that followed was not the kind born of comfort, but of anticipation. Something was waiting here, something stitched into the walls, the air, the very bones of Blackthorn Manor. A secret, perhaps, or a reckoning long overdue. The garden at Ravenwood Estate was a masterpiece of precision, manicured hedges standing like sentinels, marble fountains whispering with the soft trickle of water, and lanterns casting a golden haze over the guests who drifted through the lawn in silk and shadow. Lady Genevieve Blackthorn stood near the terrace, her expression schooled into a mask of effortless grace, though the tightness around her fingers, clenched lightly around the stem of a crystal flute, betrayed something else, a silent tension. a calculation running behind her cool blue gaze. Evelyn Graves moved through the gathering with the practiced ease of a woman who knew how to be both seen and unseen, her dark eyes catching the subtle missteps beneath the polished spectacle, the half-second hesitation in a laugh, the way certain conversations tapered off when others drew near, the way power shifted in the smallest of glances. Near the rose trellis, Lord Alistair Pembroke, a man with the build of a prizefighter but the smirk of a gambler, leaned in close to Nicholas Fairchild, heir to the estate, and by all accounts, a man caught between inheritance and expectation. "This is a dangerous game, Fairchild," Pembroke murmured, swirling his drink lazily, his voice the sort that carried just enough to be overheard by the right ears. "And you're not the sort built to win it." Nicholas's smile was precise, the kind that suggested he had learned long ago how to wear armor made of charm. "Then perhaps you should place your bets elsewhere," he replied smoothly, though his grip on his glass was just a fraction too tight. Evelyn caught the exchange from the corner of her eye, her curiosity sharpening. Pembroke chuckled, a slow, deliberate sound, before taking a measured sip of his scotch. "Oh, but where's the fun in that?" he mused before stepping away, disappearing into the throng with the ease of a man who thrived in the shifting tides of influence. Across the lawn, Lady Genevieve's gaze followed them, unreadable, distant, and yet waiting. A rustle of skirts near the balustrade made Evelyn glance sideways, just in time to catch a glimpse of the maid, Marian, if she recalled correctly, hovering too close to the shadows, her eyes darting toward Nicholas and Pembroke, before snapping away the moment she realized she was being observed. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face, fear, guilt, or something far more dangerous. Then just as quickly, she dipped her head and busied herself with arranging an already perfect tray of drinks. Evelyn's lips pressed together. She had seen that look before. Outside the estate walls, the wind stirred the branches of the old oaks, a whisper through the leaves, a warning, perhaps. The night was still young, the air thick with the scent of roses and deception, and somewhere beneath all the refinement, beneath the gleaming silver and careful laughter, something waited, a secret, a scandal, or perhaps, if history was inclined to repeat itself, a body. The evening air hung thick with the scent of roses, and something unspoken, a tautness threading through the laughter and clinking glasses, like a violin string wound a touch too tight. Evelyn Harrow, comfortably settled near an ivy-clad balustrade, observed the crowd with the cool detachment of a woman who had long understood that the most dangerous truths were never spoken aloud. It wasn't the grand declarations of the men puffed up with their own importance, nor the carefully curated pleasantries of the women that interested her. It was the way Lady Eleanor Blackthorn's gloved fingers tightened fractionally whenever her son Julian exchanged hushed words with Lord Somerset. It was the brief flicker of unease that crossed Julian's face when Somerset laughed, the kind of laugh that sought to remind the world who held the reins, and it was the way Margaret Finch, the young maid with quiet hands and watchful eyes, flinched just barely when Somerset's gaze swept over her, as though cataloguing an old inconvenient memory. Margaret moved between the guests with the efficiency of a girl who had spent years perfecting the art of vanishing into the background, but tonight something was different. She wasn't quite invisible enough. Somerset, broad-shouldered and thick with the weight of a man who had never been denied, turned his head toward her with something close to recognition, not a glance but a tethered pull, a slow, inexorable fastening of attention. Margaret, for her part, felt it. Evelyn saw the way her posture shifted, the smallest of pauses before she dipped her chin and murmured, "Champagne, my lord." Her voice was level, practiced, but Evelyn caught the tension in her fingers as she poured, the brief tremor in her wrist that sent a single drop spilling onto the pristine white of the linen. Somerset's lips curled, slow and deliberate. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you?" The words were light, but the intent behind them wasn't. Margaret's expression remained smooth, but Evelyn did not miss the way her breathing hitched, the fleeting betrayal of unease before she curtsied and vanished into the milling throng. Somerset watched her go, his expression dark with something unreadable, something that stirred unease deep in Evelyn's chest. The night deepened, the garden party unraveling into the quiet murmur of farewells and the fading strains of a waltz, but the air had thickened with something that would not leave. Evelyn, seated near the terrace, caught a flicker of movement just beyond the columned archway. Margaret slipping into the house, quick and silent, her skirts barely brushing against the doorway. A moment later, another shadow moved. Somerset, his usual air of idle arrogance had sharpened into something else, something colder, his features set in grim focus as he followed her inside with the deliberation of a man intent on retrieving something that did not wish to be found. Evelyn exhaled slowly, setting down her untouched drink, a maid slipping away unnoticed, a man following close behind. She had seen enough of life to know that one of them was running, and the other was hunting. The hush that settled over Blackthorn Manor was the kind that came when a house had hosted too much conversation, too much wine, and far too many secrets. The last of the guests had gone, leaving the corridors in a hush that should have stretched unbroken until morning. But silence, much like decorum, was a fragile thing. Evelyn, in the sanctuary of her guest quarters, had just loosened the pins from her hair when she heard it. A sound out of place, a sharp, distant exclamation, then a thud, low and heavy. She went utterly still, her fingers curling over the brocade coverlet. A house of this size carried many noises, doors closing, whispers in dim-lit hallways, the occasional muffled laughter of the household staff. This was not one of those sounds. Then, clearer this time, a voice, hoarse, edged with something dangerously close to panic, a man's voice. "Help!" Evelyn rose in a single fluid motion, crossing the room to the door, her pulse a steady measured rhythm against the silence. Somewhere within the vast corridors of Blackthorn Manor, something had broken the careful balance of the night. And if there was one thing she knew about this house, it was that broken things did not mend themselves. The air in Blackthorn Manor had shifted, thickening into something taut and electric, the way the sky feels before a storm. Evelyn Harrow moved swiftly through the dim corridor, the silk hem of her dressing gown barely sighing against the polished wood as she reached the library door. There, standing rigid as a sentinel, was Captain Alistair Munro, his jaw set, his face a shade paler beneath the flickering glow of the gaslight. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment she saw it, a fracture in the composure he so carefully maintained. It wasn't fear, no, it was something sharper, something like disbelief. The library door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway, thick and impenetrable as ink. Munro shifted slightly, exhaling through his nose. His voice, when it came, was taut, each word and precise. "Somerset," he said. "He's dead." Evelyn did not flinch. Death, after all, had a way of making itself comfortable in houses like these. Instead she stepped past Munro, and pushed the heavy door open. The scent of cigar smoke still hung in the air, but it was undercut by something else, something unmistakable, gunpowder, acrid and final. And there, sprawled across the thick Persian rug, was Lord Nathaniel Somerset. His waistcoat, once immaculately pressed, was now askew, his limbs splayed in an almost theatrical mockery of welcome. The silk of his evening shirt was no longer pristine. A single ruinous bloom of crimson had spread over his chest, the wound clean and precise, a single shot, intentional, calculated. Evelyn's gaze flicked downward. Near the tip of his polished boot lay a spent casing, its brass surface catching the low light. Just inches away, his overturned glass of brandy bled its amber contents into the fibers of the rug, soaking into the fabric like a creeping stain. She turned her attention to the window, latched, unbroken, no forced entry, a locked room murder then. A professional would have wiped the casing, removed the weapon, left no trace. But this was a message. Munro dragged a hand over his jaw, his brow furrowed. "No sign of a struggle," he murmured, almost to himself. Whoever did this, Somerset either trusted them, or never saw it coming. Evelyn studied the body with the quiet scrutiny of someone piecing together a puzzle. "Oh, I rather think he saw it coming," she murmured. And if the way Somerset had spent the evening watching Margaret, the maid with the careful hands and frightened eyes, was anything to go by, he had known exactly what was coming for him. The only question was who had gotten to him first. The library had a way of keeping secrets, of trapping words in the fibers of its velvet drapes and between the pages of its leather-bound tomes. Tonight, it had trapped something else. The lingering hush of death. Lord Somerset's body lay still, his cooling blood spreading slowly beneath him, his final moment frozen in eerie quiet. Evelyn shifted her gaze to Monroe, who was studying her as if she too were a piece of the mystery. The silence did not last. Footsteps hurried, uneven, echoed down the corridor, a presence gathering speed, carrying urgency, and then, in the doorway, Mrs. Langley, the housekeeper. 30 years of service had hardened her, but tonight, standing under the heavy glow of the library chandelier, she looked as though she had glimpsed something unholy. Her voice, when she spoke, trembled at the edges. "It's Margaret," she said. "She's gone." The words hung, weighty and irrevocable. Evelyn did not react, not immediately. Instead, she watched the way the room absorbed the news. Lady Eleanor, standing near the fireplace, stiffened so slightly it was almost imperceptible. Julian Blackthorne let out a breath too sharp, his fingers tightening over the back of a leather chair. Monroe's frown deepened, but his expression remained unreadable. "Gone," he repeated, his tone edged with steel. "Mrs. Langley wrung her hands, a habit long since buried, but unearthed now, in the face of something she could not explain. Her room is empty, her uniform is there, folded as if she meant to return, but she's nowhere to be found." The room exhaled a collective breath. Not relief, never that, but something shifting from shock into speculation, and then the whispers began. "Gone in the middle of the night, she must have run, or she was taken." Evelyn remained silent. People revealed more when they thought they were only speculating. "She was acting strangely all evening," someone muttered. "You saw her spill that champagne at the party." She looked uneasy around Somerset. A theory was taking shape, gathering weight like storm clouds on the horizon. And Evelyn, standing amidst the murmurs, knew one thing with certainty: Margaret's disappearance was no coincidence. And if she wasn't already dead, then somewhere in this house, she was running out of time. The hush in Ashworth Manor was the kind that settled into the bones, a silence not of peace, but of something unspoken, something waiting to surface. The scent of last night's dying fire still clung to the drapes as Eleanor Blackwell smoothed a hand over the silk of her dressing gown, her gaze flicking toward the empty space where only hours ago Henry Ashworth had stood. Now he was dead, and Cecilia was gone. 1 and 1 made 2. Unless of course it didn't. She left nothing behind. Eleanor's voice was mild, but the question carried weight. Mrs. Lyle, the housekeeper, twisted the hem of her apron between stiff fingers, her face tight with something between worry and disbelief. "No, miss, her uniform's still there, folded neat as always, but her things, her letters, gone. As if she just vanished." That was the part that troubled Eleanor. Cecilia was careful, deliberate. She wouldn't have simply disappeared, not unless someone had a reason for making it so, and that was a very different kind of problem. The grandfather clock in the hall groaned out 12 heavy chimes, each one rolling through the house like an ill-timed joke. A second later, the front doors banged open, and the night air dragged in the scent of damp earth and candle smoke. The police had arrived. Inspector Calloway stepped inside, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He was broad-shouldered, his face worn from too many cases that never quite fit neatly into reports. His gaze swept the study, taking in the body sprawled near the hearth, the crystal glass tipped onto its side, the dark stain creeping through the Persian rug. His expression did not change. Not when his eyes flicked to the gathered household, their tense murmurs curling around them like smoke. "No one leaves," he said, his voice low, measured, a ripple of protest, half-formed questions, feigned outrage. Calloway ignored them. "I'll need statements from everyone," he continued, "and I'll be starting with the maid." Silence. Lady Winifred, seated stiff-backed near the fireplace, cleared her throat. "Cecilia is missing." Calloway turned his gaze to her, sharp and unreadable. "Missing?" Mrs. Lyle stepped forward, her hands still twisting. "She's not in her room, sir. Her uniform's there, her apron, even the locket she always wore. But she's gone." The inspector's expression barely flickered. A small shift of interest, nothing more. "I see," he said. Then his attention landed on Eleanor. "You were the first to find the body, Miss Blackwell." Eleanor inclined her head. "After Captain Alden, yes." Calloway studied her, his silence dragging long enough to feel like a weight. "And do you believe the maid killed him?" Eleanor considered the question. Then with a slight tilt of her head, she said, "I think that would be convenient." Something that might have been amusement ghosted over Calloway's face, but it was gone too quickly to be certain. He turned back to the men at the door. "Lock the house. Cecilia Wakefield is either a murderer on the run." He let the words settle, let the weight of them press into the room. Then quietly, he finished, "or a dead girl waiting to be found." Dawn broke over Ashworth Manor with a heavy sky, and the scent of rain, as if the night itself had soaked into the very walls. The usual morning rituals, coffee poured into fine porcelain, the gentle scrape of silver against bone china, were conspicuously absent. Instead, the household sat in brittle silence, the tension wound too tight to be mistaken for grief alone. Eleanor, seated at the far end of the long oak table, observed with quiet precision. Silence, after all, said more than words ever could. Lady Winifred's hands rested lightly against her teacup, though she had yet to take a sip. The headache she had conveniently retired with the night before seemed to linger, judging by the pinch in her expression. Captain Alden was restless, turning his spoon between his fingers, his movements clipped, impatient, a man pacing in his mind even when his body remained still. Near the window, Julian Wakefield sat stiff-backed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, as though expecting something to emerge from the mist. And in the far corner, half hidden by the silver serving trolley, Mrs. Lyle wrung her hands, her usual sternness, softened by unease. Despite the grandeur of the dining hall, the house felt smaller now. Murder did that. Eleanor lifted her cup, watching the steam curl into the air. It wasn't just fear that had taken root in this house. Not just grief. It was something else, something sharper. Panic, carefully controlled. It was there in the way Julian's fingers tapped against the polished wood, the way Lady Winifred's gaze flicked toward the window, as if anticipating a consequence not yet arrived. It lingered in the air, thick as the scent of damp stone, as the whispers between servants who moved through the room with measured grace, their expressions carefully blank. Eleanor caught the eye of one of the housemaids. The girl paled, and looked away. Cecilia had been well liked, quiet perhaps, but not the kind of girl who made enemies, and yet she had disappeared, or been made to, and if she wasn't already dead, then somewhere in this house, she was running out of time. A heavy fog curled around Blackthorn Manor, swallowing the moonlight, and pressing against the grand frost-laced windows. By the time the clock struck midnight, Harold Litchfield was dead, his body sprawled across the library's Persian rug, a crystal tumbler of whiskey shattered beside him. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, only the eerie stillness of a man whose life had been neatly, efficiently snuffed out. Miss Eleanor Ashcroft, draped in a night robe of deep emerald silk, observed the scene with the measured detachment of a woman, accustomed to unraveling the ugliness beneath polished surfaces. The butler, Mr. Canning, stood rigid by the doorway, his face pale as parchment, while Lady Beatrice Litchfield pressed a trembling hand to her throat. "He was alive at supper," she whispered, as if clinging to the absurd hope that speaking the words might reverse the night's cruel twist. The arrival of Inspector Alden Greaves was heralded by the steady click of polished boots against marble floors, his presence a quiet force that stilled the anxious murmurs in the room. Broad-shouldered, his sharp gaze cut through the gathered guests like a scalpel, dissecting their fear, their shock, their carefully constructed facades. "No one leaves the estate," he said, his voice measured, absolute. A ripple of unease passed through the room, barely concealed outrage from those unaccustomed to being treated as suspects. Greaves ignored it. "Statements will be taken immediately, and I will be starting with the house staff." A sharp intake of breath from the housekeeper, Mrs. Lane. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Miss Winifred, she's missing." A hush fell on Miss Winifred Langley, the governess. Mild-mannered, soft-spoken, unremarkable, or so it had seemed, until now. Greaves barely reacted, but Eleanor did not miss the flicker of something in his gaze, something cool and assessing. "When was she last seen?" he asked. "Not since this evening," Mrs. Lane whispered. "Her room's undisturbed, but she's nowhere in the house." A vanishing, so neatly executed it, sent a fresh chill through Eleanor's veins. A woman fleeing in the night, or a woman who had already met the same fate as Harold. The dawn was slow to break over Blackthorn Manor, its golden fingers struggling to pry through the dense grey clouds that pressed heavily over the countryside. The usual symphony of clinking silverware and murmured pleasantries at breakfast was replaced by an oppressive silence. Lady Beatrice sat pale and rigid at the head of the table, her teacup untouched, while Theodore Harrow, Lichfield's long-time associate, stirred his coffee absently, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Across from him, Julian Graves, the estate's young solicitor, drummed his fingers against the mahogany tabletop, his movements sharp and restless. They were waiting, not just for answers, but for something worse. The tension was thick, palpable, laced with something Eleanor recognized well: fear. She watched, silent, taking in the glances exchanged, the way Lady Beatrice's hands twisted in her lap, the way Julian's mouth pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Whatever they feared, it was not discovery, it was what might come next. The house, for all its grandeur, had shrunk under the weight of its secrets. Eleanor, ever the observer, let the tension settle around her like a shroud, her fingers light on the rim of her teacup. No one ate much. No one spoke of Miss Winifred's disappearance, but the air was thick with the unspoken, and Eleanor, sipping her tea, let her gaze drift to the far corner, where a maid stood stiffly by the silver serving trolley. The girl was staring, not at the guests, but at the door leading to the east wing. A door that should have been locked, a door that in the quiet of dawn stood slightly ajar. Eleanor set her cup down, the soft chime against porcelain lost in the hush. Whatever lay beyond that door, it was waiting to be found. The evening mist clung to Ashworth Manor, like a restless spectre, creeping through the ancient oak trees, curling against the cold iron gates, slipping through the cracks beneath the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air felt too thick, too still, the kind of silence that came when people were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The crystal chandelier above the grand staircase cast long shadows across the polished floor, twisting as the candlelight flickered. There had been laughter earlier, strained, brittle laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. But by midnight, all that remained was the scent of brandy, perfume, and the quiet rot of something hidden beneath the surface. And then, at precisely 11 o'clock, the housekeeper screamed. The guests gathered in the study, their faces pale in the glow of the firelight, their eyes wide with something that was not quite shock, but something close enough to pass for it. There, sprawled across the marble floor, was Lord Reginald Fairfax, his once commanding presence reduced to a twisted corpse, his mouth slightly open as if his last breath had been stolen mid-sentence. The glass of cognac lay shattered beside him, the amber liquid bleeding into the cracks between the marble. but it was the handwritten note clenched in his stiff fingers that drew everyone's attention, its ink smudged, its edges torn. Inspector Everett Dane crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes narrowing as he pried the note loose from Fairfax's rigid grip. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, written by someone who either had no time or had too much to fear. "I know what you did, and now so do they." A beat of silence followed, a heavy, suffocating silence. Then Lady Eleanor Fairfax, standing in the doorway, drew in a slow, measured breath. Her fingers trembled just slightly against the polished wood of the doorframe. He was fine at dinner," she whispered. A simple statement, but Inspector Dane caught the slight hesitation, the way her throat tightened just before she spoke. A lie, then, a careful, practiced one. From the corner of the room, Miss Josephine Aldridge, the guest who always seemed to notice things others missed, let out a soft hum. "And yet," she murmured, her voice like silk edged with steel, "not fine enough to live." The questioning began. Lord Thomas Winslow, a politician whose career had been built on careful words and even more careful lies, insisted he had been reading in the library. The maid Agnes swore she had seen something, a flicker of movement near the study door before the lights dimmed. Philip Vance, Fairfax's most trusted confidant, left the smoking lounge just 10 minutes before the body was found. His shirt cuffs were damp, from what he wouldn't say. Miss Aldridge watched them all, the way they spoke, the way they didn't. Lies weren't always in the words themselves, they were in the pauses, in the breathing, in the way someone's gaze lingered a moment too long in the wrong direction. And by the time the last question was asked, she had learned 3 things. 1. Someone had rifled through Lord Fairfax's desk after he had died. 2. There were exactly 3 keys to the study, and 1 was missing. 3. The grandfather clock in the hall had stopped at exactly 10:56 p.m., and on the brass pendulum, smeared like a ghostly signature, fresh ink. She exhaled slowly, turning the puzzle pieces over in her mind. Someone in Ashworth Manor had played a dangerous game, and now someone else was ready to finish it. The air inside Ravenshire Manor was thick with the weight of unspoken things, the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from something far more insidious, secrets. The chandelier above the grand dining table flickered, casting distorted shadows along the silk-draped walls, turning the faces of those seated into half-lit masks, hiding as much as they revealed. It was a dinner meant to display unity, but the fractures were too deep to be ignored. At the head of the table, Lady Margaret Henshaw sat with the posture of a queen guarding a crumbling empire, her fingers gliding along the stem of her untouched wine glass. To her right, her son Edgar barely touched his meal, the silverware in his hand tense as if he was restraining himself from throwing it down altogether. Across from him, Lord Theodore Greaves, a man who had built his career on calculated charm, offered an easy smile. Too easy, the kind that masked something rotting beneath. Everyone in this room was here because they had something to lose, and one of them was already losing control. The conversation stumbled forward, thin threads of pleasantries fraying against the edges of tension. It wasn't until Lady Margaret, her voice silk-wrapped steel, casually inquired about Edgar's upcoming inheritance dealings that the air turned razor-sharp. Edgar exhaled slowly, setting his glass down a fraction too hard. "Is now really the time, Mother?" His voice held a warning, but Margaret's brows barely lifted, the only sign she even acknowledged his irritation. "Life doesn't stop for grief," she murmured. Then after the briefest pause her voice dipped colder, "or for scandal." A knife scraped against a plate. Theodore Greaves' hand stilled against his napkin. Edgar's jaw tightened just slightly, the flickering candlelight catching the pulse in his temple. Scandal. That was what this dinner was about. Control. Containment. Keeping the house standing even as the foundation cracked beneath them. At the far end of the table, Miss Evelyn Harrow, a guest who always listened more than she spoke, took a slow sip of her tea, watching as the invisible war played out between them. She had been in enough houses like this to know how they fell. Not from an outside blow, but from the rot spreading from within, and Ravenshire Manor was already rotting. Long past midnight, the house held the kind of silence that felt like it was listening. The corridors stretched like empty veins, the oil paintings watching from their gilded frames, witnesses to things they would never speak of. Evelyn, never one to trust a house where people were pretending not to watch each other, found herself awake at an indecent hour. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped into the hall. The floorboards whispered underfoot. Somewhere in the distance the sound of a clock's pendulum ticked once, then again, then stopped. And then a sound that didn't belong, not the creak of an old house settling, not the rustling of wind against the glass panes, something deliberate, the faint, careful scrape of a drawer sliding open. She followed it, moving as silent as a shadow, down the corridor past the great staircase, toward the library. Light spilled out from beneath the heavy oak door, a sliver of movement inside. Not an empty room then. She stepped forward, easing the door open just enough to see Theodore Greaves, bent over the grand mahogany desk, his expression drawn tight, his hands moving quickly but carefully through a stack of papers. One hand buried deep in an open drawer, the other resting on the polished surface as if grounding himself. He wasn't simply looking for something, he was desperate to find it. Evelyn, polite as ever, cleared her throat. Theodore froze, then with the smooth efficiency of a man used to improvising, he straightened, turning toward her with a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either, Miss Harrow." Evelyn stepped fully into the room, her gaze flicking just briefly to the papers he had been rifling through. She smiled, pleasant but unconvinced. "Oh, I do find a bit of fresh air helps," she murmured, glancing toward the open drawer. "Or I suppose a bit of light reading." Theodore relaxed his stance, leaning back against the desk, the perfect image of ease. "Nothing as entertaining as that, I'm afraid," he said smoothly, the faintest touch of amusement in his voice. "Too practiced. I misplaced a key. Thought I might have left it here." Evelyn's gaze flicked downward. The drawer was lined neatly with documents. No signs of rummaging for a key. My, she said, letting the words linger just long enough, her tone featherlight with curiosity. "What a bother, and did you find it?" Theodore's hesitation was fractional, but she caught it. Outside the window, the wind howled. Inside the house held its breath. The rain had started as a whisper against the stained glass windows of Blackwood Manor, soft and persistent, a rhythmic hush that filled the great empty corridors with a sense of waiting. By the time the clock in the grand foyer struck midnight, it had become a relentless downpour, drowning out all but the sharp crackle of the fire in the parlor, where Lady Eleanor sat, poised and eerily composed, her gloved hands resting lightly against the arms of the high-backed chair. Across from her, Inspector Alistair Reed stood, his trench coat still damp from the storm, his sharp gaze never wavering from the woman before him. "Curious, isn't it?" he mused, his voice smooth, deliberate, "that a man with so many enemies should meet such an abrupt and violent end, and yet no one seems the least bit surprised." Lady Eleanor lifted a single brow, the faintest hint of amusement flickering at the corner of her lips. "Is that so?" Reed tilted his head, stepping closer, the polished floorboards groaning beneath his weight. "Henry Whitmore was not a man who inspired kindness, I'll grant you that. He held debts over the heads of nearly half the aristocracy in this town, but murder," he let the word settle between them, "murder is an entirely different game, wouldn't you say?" She didn't flinch, nor did she avert her gaze. Instead, she reached for the delicate porcelain teacup on the side table, bringing it to her lips as if they were discussing the evening's weather. "Inspector, if you intend to imply that I had something to do with Mr. Whitmore's untimely demise, I must remind you that I spent the entirety of last evening in the company of my guests, none of whom, I dare say, are in the habit of engaging in violent crimes." Reed smiled faintly. "I've no doubt your alibi is meticulously crafted, Lady Eleanor, but tell me, if you were to hazard a guess, who in this house might have had the strongest motive to see him dead?" Her fingers tightened around the delicate china, though the movement was barely perceptible. A pause, then ever so softly, "Perhaps the question is not who had the strongest motive, Inspector, but who had the nerve to act on it." Reed exhaled, turning slightly as his gaze drifted toward the dimly lit hallway beyond. The house was too quiet, even for a night of mourning. He had learned long ago that silence was not the absence of noise, but rather the presence of something deliberately left unsaid. A creak above them, a footstep, halting, uncertain, then just as quickly, retreating. Reed's eyes narrowed. "It seems we are not alone." Lady Eleanor set her cup down with an almost imperceptible clink, her expression unreadable. "No, Inspector, it seems we never were." With measured steps Reed moved toward the grand staircase, his shadow stretching long against the candle-lit walls. Someone had been listening, watching, and if his instincts were right, they were far from done playing their part in this deadly game. The storm had not yet passed, but in the dim morning light, Ravensbrook Manor sat still and silent, as if holding its breath. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, whispering against the tall windows, casting silver rivulets down the glass like ink bleeding across parchment. A distant rumble of thunder threatened beyond the moors, but within these walls another storm was brewing, one of secrets long buried and truths clawing their way to the surface. Lady Margaret moved through the library with deliberate grace, the hem of her dressing gown brushing against the Persian rug as her fingers ghosted over the spines of worn leather-bound books. The faint scent of damp wood and aged paper filled the air, but beneath it was something else, something colder, a presence unseen yet unmistakable, lingering like an unfinished sentence in the air. She had spent too many years in the company of deception not to recognize its weight pressing against her skin. She knelt beside the great mahogany desk, her sharp eyes tracing the ornate carvings that curled along its edge, twisting vines, gilded leaves, and between them, a subtle, nearly imperceptible seam in the wood. There, a crack just wide enough to suggest a hidden compartment. With the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to secrets, she pressed against it, a soft click. The panel slid open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with deep blue ribbon, their edges yellowed with time. Margaret's breath caught as she reached for them, her pulse quickening in the hush of the room. She unfolded the topmost letter, its paper thin and brittle beneath her touch. The ink had faded but was still legible, spidery handwriting, precise, meticulous. A name repeated through financial records, land transfers, confidential agreements. Every document pointed to a single figure, Sir Alfred Montague, a man who had prided himself on discretion, a man who had been found dead in his study, not 24 hours ago, slumped over this very desk, his face twisted in an expression of silent horror. A slow, measured breath escaped her lips. This was not merely a scandal, this was motive. Sir Alfred had been hiding something, something worth killing for, and someone in this house had known exactly what. A floorboard groaned behind her, a creak, deliberate and unhurried. Margaret's head snapped up, her fingers tightening around the papers. The heavy library door stood ajar, and framed against the dim corridor was Mr. Hawthorne, the steward of the estate. His gaze flickered briefly to the documents before settling on Margaret with something between curiosity and calculation. He did not seem surprised to find her here. That, more than anything, unsettled her. "You're up early, Lady Margaret." His voice was smooth, practiced, too even. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, slipping the papers back into their compartment with deliberate nonchalance. Tragic circumstances tend to unsettle one's rest. Hawthorne stepped further into the room, the firelight casting sharp angles across his face, shadowing his eyes. "Indeed, and yet some might argue that certain discoveries can be even more unsettling." Margaret met his gaze evenly, her expression unreadable, but her mind was already racing. He knew, or at the very least, he suspected. The weight of unspoken knowledge hung between them like a dagger in the dark, poised between threat and invitation. A game was beginning, one of deception and careful misdirection, and in Ravensbrook Manor, where the walls held their secrets close and whispers carried farther than footsteps, only one truth remained certain: whoever played it best would survive to see its end. The morning air in Ashford House was thick with the scent of damp stone and fading candle wax, the weight of secrecy pressing against the high, wood-panelled walls. Lady Evelyn Carrington moved through the dimly lit corridors with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years walking the fine edge between decorum and curiosity. In her gloved hand she clutched a telegram, unsigned, urgent, and cryptic. The words were few, but they carried the unmistakable chill of warning. What was taken must be returned before it is too late. If you value your life, do not ask questions. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line as she entered the drawing-room. She had spent the night replaying the previous day's events. Sir Lionel Ashford's sudden collapse, the whispered exchanges between the guests, the way certain individuals had avoided meeting her gaze. Something had been taken from the study just hours before his death, something worth killing for, and now someone wanted it back. A rustle from the far end of the room made her glance up. There in the half-shadow stood Mr. Caldwell, the estate's steward, his eyes sharp beneath the guise of indifference. "Early to be reading telegrams, Lady Evelyn," he observed, his voice smooth but edged with quiet suspicion. Evelyn smiled faintly, tucking the telegram into the folds of her sleeve. "Some matters cannot wait for the comfort of daylight, Mr. Caldwell." His gaze flickered, just for a moment, toward the desk near the window, the very one Sir Lionel had collapsed upon. She noted it but said nothing. Instead she turned and moved to the cabinet, where decanters of sherry stood untouched. There was a subtle gap between them, a space where another bottle should have been. The missing bottle, the one Sir Lionel had poured from just before he fell. The silence between them thickened. Evelyn could feel the weight of Caldwell's scrutiny, the tension wrapped beneath the civility of their exchange. He was waiting for something, for her to confirm what she knew, or for her to make a mistake. Before she could speak, the stillness was broken by the shrill ring of the house telephone. The maid hesitated in the doorway, glancing nervously at Evelyn before hurrying to answer. Evelyn watched as the girl's fingers trembled slightly over the receiver. "Hello?" A pause, then the color drained from her face. I'm sorry, sir, but Lady Evelyn." She stopped abruptly, listening. Evelyn could hear the faint hum of a voice on the other end, low, deliberate. Then the maid's eyes flicked to her, uncertain. "Yes, I understand," she said finally, then replaced the receiver with unsteady hands. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart hammering. "Who was that?" The girl swallowed hard. They asked only one question, milady." Evelyn waited. The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "They asked if the key had been found." For a long moment, no one moved. The grandfather clock in the hall marked each second with heavy, deliberate ticks, a reminder that time was slipping away. Caldwell exhaled slowly, watching her. "It seems, Lady Evelyn," he murmured, "that someone believes you are holding something rather important." Evelyn met his gaze, steel for steel. "Then we had best discover what they are willing to kill for, Mr. Caldwell, before they decide to collect it in blood." The dining hall of Blackwood Manor shimmered under the weight of its crystal chandeliers, casting fractured light upon the long gleaming table where a carefully arranged supper lay untouched. The guests were seated, but no one ate. Every eye, every nervous glance, every clenched jaw was drawn toward one man, Charles Ashford. He sat stiffly at the head of the table, shoulders squared like a soldier, awaiting the order to march to his doom. Across from him, Lady Eleanor's wineglass remained poised mid-air, her fingers curled around the stem with a delicate tension that betrayed nothing. And yet, Miss Beatrice Holloway, seated near the end, saw everything. The way the butler's grip lingered a fraction too long on the decanter, The way young Evelyn's gaze darted toward the study doors, as if expecting them to burst open at any moment. Then, as if striking a match in the dark, Charles set his silverware down with a decisive clang. "I believe," he said, voice carefully controlled, "that I should leave for London at first light." A sharp inhale cut through the silence. Lady Eleanor did not turn her head, but her expression cooled by a fraction. "No," she said simply. Charles' eyes flashed. "I don't believe I was asking permission, Mother." The room held its breath. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker uncertainly. Then Eleanor smiled, a slow knowing thing that sent a chill rippling through Beatrice's spine. "I think," Eleanor murmured, tilting her head ever so slightly, "you know precisely why you must stay." Charles' fingers twitched against the tablecloth. It was a battle not just of words, but of power, a quiet, deadly contest played behind measured tones and fine etiquette. And in that instant, Beatrice saw it, fear. Not irritation, not frustration, but true unspoken fear in Charles' taut posture. She folded her hands in her lap, watching, waiting. The game was unfolding, and she was not merely an observer. The night was thick with the scent of damp leaves as Beatrice stepped carefully along the gravel path leading toward the abandoned greenhouse. Blackwood Manor was silent, but it was not at rest. She had seen too much that evening to dismiss the way unease had settled like a fog over the house. Somewhere in the shadows, danger lurked. The greenhouse, its once grand glass panels now cracked with time and neglect, loomed ahead, its door hanging slightly ajar. A candle flickered from within. Beatrice hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The scent of damp and rotting petals filled the air. Then a rustle, a breath too sharp and too frightened to belong to anything but a person. Beatrice's pulse quickened. "Miss Caldwell," she said softly, stepping forward. The girl was barely visible, a trembling silhouette hunched beside an overturned planter. Her hands were smeared with dirt, her dress torn at the hem. She looked up, wide-eyed, face ghostly pale in the candlelight. "I didn't mean to see it," Miss Caldwell whispered, voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I didn't mean to. But he—" A sob caught in her throat. "I saw Charles bury it." Beatrice felt the cold truth settle over her like a weight. "Bury what, my dear?" Miss Caldwell swallowed hard, shaking her head. "Not what?" she whispered. "Who?" The flickering oil lamp cast elongated shadows against the walls of the abandoned boathouse, where the scent of damp wood and forgotten secrets lingered in the cold air. Evelyn Harcourt sat hunched on a rickety chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Across from her, Miss Beatrice Holloway observed her with the careful patience of a woman who had long mastered the art of waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Evelyn shuddered beneath the thick wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I knew something was wrong," she murmured, voice raw from exhaustion. "For months I'd been tracking financial ledgers, government reports, small discrepancies that no one else noticed. At first I thought it was mere oversight. But the more I looked, the more I saw money shifting hands where it shouldn't, properties being bought and sold in secret, names appearing where they had no business being." Her breath hitched as she twisted her hands together. "I couldn't report it. Not yet. Not without proof." She swallowed hard. "And then that night, I heard voices in the study." Beatrice remained perfectly still, her sharp gaze never leaving Evelyn's face. "You listened?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was passing through the corridor when I heard Lord Blackwood laughing. He wasn't alone, he was speaking to Simon Rowntree, telling him he had everything he needed to bring him down. The bribes, the embezzlement, the forgeries, he said, not even your allies can protect you now." A tremor ran through her body. Simon begged him to reconsider. He pleaded for another way. But Blackwood, he just smiled and said, "This isn't a game of negotiation." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, as if willing herself not to see the memory. and then the shot rang out. Beatrice leaned forward slightly, her expression composed but keen. "You ran." "I had no choice," Evelyn whispered. "If Simon found me, I'd be next, so I hid. I waited until the house went still, until the servants began whispering about an unfortunate accident. And then I did what I do best. I gathered proof." She lifted her chin, something hard glinting in her weary eyes. "I have it, Miss Holloway, the ledgers, the signed documents, the hidden accounts, enough to expose Simon Rowntree for corruption," her breath hitched, "and for murder." Beatrice reached across the table, resting a steadying hand over Evelyn's trembling fingers. "Then, my dear," she said softly, "it's time we bring this to light." The storm outside had eased into a slow, steady drizzle by the time Beatrice and Evelyn made their way through the winding halls of Blackwood Manor, the air thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. They found Inspector Hadley in the grand study, nursing a lukewarm glass of brandy. His eyes narrowed with irritation the moment they entered. "If you've come to bring me more trouble, Miss Holloway," he said dryly, setting his glass down, "I might need a stronger drink." Beatrice smiled, but there was a sharpness beneath her pleasant expression. "Oh, Inspector," she said smoothly, "you mustn't give me so much credit. I simply listen, and occasionally people tell me the most fascinating things." Hadley's gaze flicked to Evelyn, assessing, calculating. Then with a weary sigh, he straightened. "Very well," he muttered. "Let's hear it." And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the mist-laden estate, the carefully constructed lies that had shrouded Blackwood Manor in silence were finally about to unravel. The grand drawing-room of Ashworth Manor had never felt so suffocating. The heavy drapes allowed only slivers of the pale morning light to filter through, casting long uncertain shadows across the polished mahogany floor. The air carried a strange weight, like a storm about to break. Margaret Holloway sat near the cold, unlit hearth, hands folded, her gaze steady as she observed the gathering storm around her. Across from her, Inspector Alden Greaves stood rigid, arms crossed, his lined face betraying no emotion save for the sharp glint of calculation in his eyes. "You asked us here for questioning," Lord Percival Ashworth said, his voice clipped, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "Get on with it." Margaret tilted her head slightly, a hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Oh, but I do enjoy setting the stage properly," she said, voice light yet deliberate. "After all, a truth rushed is often a truth lost." Silence stretched taut as a noose. In the far corner, Eleanor Ashworth, draped in a deep emerald gown, sat with perfect composure, though Margaret did not miss the telltale way her fingers clenched against the silk of her skirts. "Let's not pretend," came a voice, low, shaking with barely contained nerves. The room turned. Henry Ellsworth stood near the bookcase, eyes darting between faces, his breath uneven. "We all know why we're here." Margaret did not move, but she caught the subtle shift in Greaves' posture, an infinitesimal lean forward, sensing the moment before it truly arrived. "Then by all means, Mr. Ellsworth," Margaret said softly, "do enlighten us." A shuddering exhale. "I have proof," Henry rasped. "Of the bribes, the fraudulent accounts, the land seized under false pretenses. It was all orchestrated to protect the Ashworth name." His gaze landed on Percival, and for a fleeting second, something close to fear passed between them. "You killed Elias Hargreave, to keep it hidden." A sharp intake of breath. Lady Eleanor's. Percival's jaw clenched. Inspector Greaves' expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened, absorbing every shift, every tick. Margaret simply pressed on, voice unhurried, yet precise. "We need to do this properly. If we confront Lord Ashworth in private, his mother will bury this before it even begins." A long pause. Then a low chuckle, slow and deliberate. Percival relaxed back against his chair, a ghost of a smirk at the corner of his lips. "Ah," he murmured, "you mean a performance." Margaret's eyes twinkled in the dim light. "Oh, my dear Lord Ashworth," she mused. I do so love a grand finale. Greaves exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand across his temple. Library, at noon. We'll make it look like it. Routine questioning. Margaret beamed. Wonderful. Now then, let's ensure we have all the necessary props. The night pressed heavily against the windows as Margaret moved silently through the corridors of Ashworth Manor. There was still one final task before the morning's reckoning, to ensure the evidence remained intact. She slipped into the dimly lit study, the scent of aged paper and faintly smoldering embers clinging to the air. Her eyes swept the room, stopping at the great oak desk, its compartments concealing ledgers, letters, damning truths written in ink. She reached for the hidden panel, only to pause. Movement. Near the hearth, a figure stood with squared shoulders, hands clasped behind his back, as though bracing for impact. Captain William Halstead. His sharp features were cast in shadow, but his tension was unmistakable. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Up rather early, aren't you? Halstead did not flinch. Instead he turned to meet her gaze with a grim sort of resignation. Couldn't sleep, he muttered. Seems I'm not the only one. Margaret studied him. You're worried about Lady Eleanor. It was not a question. Halstead exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. She's about to lose everything, he admitted. Whether or not she deserves it, that's not for me to say. Margaret considered this. And Percival? His jaw tightened. He's on his own, and I suspect he knows it. Margaret gave a small, thoughtful nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Well, Captain, she said smoothly, adjusting the folds of her coat, I suppose by this time tomorrow we shall know how it all ends. Halstead's expression was unreadable. Yes, he murmured. I suppose we will. The library of Ashworth Manor felt different that morning. The grand stately air had soured into something almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves bore witness to the events of 2 nights past. Margaret sat near the fireplace, fingers lightly steepled, her expression composed, expectant. Greaves stood beside her, his usual irritation tempered by something that, if she had to name it, felt very much like anticipation. The guests had arrived as instructed, though none looked pleased to be there. Eleanor Ashworth was seated with poised precision, her gloved hands resting lightly on the arm of her chair, though Margaret did not miss the tightness in her jaw. Percival, on the other hand, leaned back in his seat with studied ease, the hint of a smirk still playing at his lips. Shall we begin? Margaret asked pleasantly, and in the silence that followed, the first move of the final act was made. The library at Ashford Manor was heavy with the scent of polished oak and old parchment, but tonight, it carried something more, a charged stillness, a breath held between past sins and impending justice. Eleanor Blackwood sat with effortless grace in the high-backed chair, her expression placid but eyes sharp as a blade. Across from her, Richard Whitmore, the ever-composed councilman, drummed his fingers against the chair's armrest, his normally smooth demeanor betrayed by the tautness in his jaw. Near the bookshelves, Colonel Harrington stood with military precision, his posture unwavering, though the flicker in his gaze suggested he was weighing the evening's revelations with meticulous care. By the door, Mrs. Hargrove, the housekeeper, clutched at the fabric of her apron, her knuckles pale, as if standing too close to a burning secret. Eleanor exhaled, her voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. Shall we begin? No one answered, so she continued, her tone deceptively light. When Mr. Langley was murdered, it first appeared to be the consequence of a powerful man entangled in too many affairs. But as I listened, as I observed, a different story emerged. Her gaze locked onto Richard, who sat frozen but for the subtle clench of his fingers. You were under quite a bit of pressure, weren't you, Mr. Whitmore? Richard's face betrayed nothing, but the stiff set of his shoulders spoke volumes. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Mrs. Hargrove told me something rather fascinating. That Evelyn, the missing maid, had been receiving official documents in the post, At first, it seemed an oddity, but then I found her ledger. Richard's fingers stilled against the wood, and Eleanor inclined her head slightly. She was meticulous, you see. Records of financial dealings, campaign funds, a secondary ledger hidden in your desk, quite resourceful for a mere housemaid. Inspector Caldwell, who had remained silent until now, reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound notebook, placing it on the table with an air of finality. Richard's expression remained impassive, but the room itself seemed to grow colder. You were paying Langley hush money. Eleanor continued, her voice almost sympathetic, as if relaying a tragic inevitability. Bribes to keep quiet about falsified campaign funds, land acquisitions made under dubious circumstances, a grand corruption scheme, woven so intricately that one misplaced thread could unravel it all. But Langley, she exhaled softly, as though picturing the man himself, was not the sort to be content. He wanted more, and that night, he demanded it. A muscle in Richard's jaw ticked, the first real crack in his facade. You went to the library late that evening, Eleanor pressed, her voice low, hypnotic. Perhaps to reason with him, perhaps to bargain, but Langley saw your desperation. He laughed at you, didn't he? Her gaze drifted momentarily toward the ornate rug, as though envisioning the exact moment. And he told you he'd ruin you anyway. She paused, just for a second. That's when you reached for the gun. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Richard exhaled, a short, breathless chuckle. A compelling story, he mused, but his voice lacked its usual effortless charm. Eleanor merely tilted her head, ever the patient observer. Oh, it's more than a story, Mr. Whitmore. Inspector Caldwell stepped forward, this time setting down a stack of carefully arranged papers. These were found in your private study, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Finalized payments, altered financial records, all leading back to you. Richard's gaze flicked to the documents, then back to the expectant eyes around the room. A calculation was being made in real time, the odds shifting with each passing second. Lady Margaret, poised as ever despite the storm brewing in her son's eyes, inhaled sharply. Eleanor watched her carefully, understanding the subtle unraveling of a woman who had spent years constructing an empire of influence. Then finally, Richard spoke, his voice a whisper of its former certainty. This is the truth, Eleanor interrupted, her voice gentle but immovable, and it has a rather unforgiving way of revealing itself. For the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore had nothing left to say, and as the first traces of morning light crept through the tall windows, Eleanor Blackwood knew that Ashford Manor would never be the same again. Edward Fairchild's fingers dug into the arms of his chair, his complexion turning pale as a cold but firm voice cut through the tense silence from the doorway. It's over, Edward. Dorothy Matthews stood just beyond the threshold, her frame slender but unwavering, her eyes burning with the weight of everything she had witnessed. For the first time since this began, Edward looked afraid. Miss Marple, seated serenely, merely adjusted the folds of her dress as if her work was finally complete. Dorothy took a slow breath, gripping the worn documents in her hands, papers that had been hidden, handled, and feared for far too many nights. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Lady Helena's composed demeanor cracked just slightly, her fingers tightening against the armrest. Captain Winslow exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward Dorothy as if she were a specter of the past, returning to claim its due. But Dorothy did not waver. I saw it, she said, her voice clear despite the exhaustion laced in her features. I saw Edward shoot Lord Bradshaw. A ripple of cold realization coursed through the room. Edward remained silent, his jaw tightening. Dorothy took a step forward. You wanted more time, she continued, her voice cold and precise. You needed a way out, but Bradshaw wasn't going to make it easy for you, was he? Edward's fingers twitched, but he still said nothing. Dorothy lowered her gaze for a moment, as if recalling every second of that night. Then her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. I was outside the library, she murmured. I heard everything. Her eyes drifted toward the desk where Bradshaw had once stood, where his life had been gambled away and ultimately taken. "He was laughing at you," she said, the memory of it sharp in her tone, "telling you there was no escape, no deal, that he was going to expose everything. The bribes, the land scandal, the campaign funds." Edward's grip on the chair tightened, his knuckles turning white. Dorothy's expression hardened. "And then you panicked, didn't you?" she pressed. "You didn't think, you just pulled the trigger." The room was deathly still. Miss Marple remained composed, hands folded in her lap, watching the final pieces fall into place. Dorothy lifted the documents she held. "These are the financial records Bradshaw had over you," she said. "The same ones I've been collecting." A pause, then her voice steadied even further. "I didn't steal them, Edward. I found them. You left them behind in your rush to cover up your crime." Another step forward, the dim light casting shadows under her weary eyes. "I ran because I knew if you saw me you'd kill me too." Edward's face remained unreadable, but the tension in his grip betrayed him. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly, watching him closely. She had seen this moment before, the precise instant when a guilty man decided whether to fight or surrender. And then Edward laughed, a low, hollow sound, as if some cruel joke had finally revealed itself to him. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, his voice oddly detached. Lady Helena inhaled sharply, but Edward did not look at her. "Bradshaw wouldn't stop," he continued, his voice strained. "I thought I could reason with him. I thought there had to be a way." He exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath. "But there wasn't." His gaze lifted, meeting Miss Marple's as if she were the only one who might understand the weight of his words. "I saw no way out," he admitted. "I panicked. I pulled the trigger before I even knew what I was doing." The air in the library thickened, heavy with the burden of his confession. Then another voice cut through, rough with something close to regret. "And then I helped cover it up." Captain Winslow's voice shattered the silence. All eyes turned to him. He had gone pale, his usual composure fraying at the edges. "I didn't know. Not at first," he said quietly. "But when I did, the walls of the library, once silent witnesses, now held yet another secret waiting to be revealed." The air in the grand hall felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, as Inspector Harrington took a measured step forward. "Jonathan Whitmore," he intoned, his voice steady, firm, unyielding. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lord Everett Gainsborough." The room seemed to contract around the accused, the once arrogant aristocrat now standing motionless, his usual sharp gaze dull, as if reality had finally sunk its claws into him. Across from him, Eleanor Ashford exhaled, her grip tightening around the worn leather journal in her hands, the very evidence that had unraveled everything. "I thought," Captain Sterling's voice cut through the silence, hesitant, burdened by guilt, "I thought it might have been an accident, or self-defense, something that could be explained away." His jaw clenched as he looked at Whitmore, something breaking behind his eyes. "But when I saw what you did, when I saw you standing over his body, wiping your hands clean, I knew." He swallowed hard. "I tampered with the crime scene," he admitted, each word heavy with shame. "Took the bullet casing, thinking if the evidence was less clear, maybe the police would look elsewhere." A bitter, humorless chuckle escaped him. "I didn't realize just how deep it all went." The admission settled over the room like dust over old bones, its finality inescapable. Lady Rosalind, who had been silent until now, let out a quiet, fractured breath, her carefully composed expression betraying the sorrow lurking beneath. She turned to Whitmore, something unreadable in her gaze, grief, disappointment, something far colder. "You were supposed to be better than this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet each syllable slicing through the tense atmosphere. Whitmore closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, the briefest flicker of something, regret, resignation, before he finally looked up, his face hollow, stripped of the arrogance he had once worn like armor. "It was never supposed to end this way," he murmured, his voice raw, as though he had only just realized the inevitability of his own downfall. But there were no bargains left to make, no schemes left to weave. Harrington stepped forward, the metallic click of the handcuffs punctuating the moment. "Jonathan Whitmore," he repeated, as if stamping the final seal on the matter. "You will stand trial for your crimes." Whitmore didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight for. Eleanor released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the journal closer to her chest. It had been a long road, nights spent poring over financial records, uncovering layers of deception, piecing together the puzzle that had led to this very moment. Lady Rosalind's shoulders shook once before Captain Sterling placed a steadying hand on her arm. Whitmore turned to her, his lips parting as if to speak, to say something, an apology, justification, but the words never came. Instead, he allowed himself to be led away, the weight of his sins dragging behind him like a shadow. Eleanor watched as the doors closed behind him, the once great Whitmore name now tarnished beyond repair. Miss Aldridge, who had observed everything from the corner, finally stirred, smoothing the front of her dress as she surveyed the wreckage left behind by ambition, greed, and desperation. "Well," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I do believe that settles the matter." And with that, the grand halls of Whitmore Estate fell into silence. Justice had been served. A week later, the newspapers feasted on the scandal: murder and corruption at Whitmore Estate, Jonathan Whitmore arrested, political scandal unveiled, bribery, deception, and a fallen legacy. The headlines painted a brutal picture. The murder charge alone had been damning enough, but it was the web of fraud, the intricate layers of bribery, land schemes, and illicit dealings that had turned his disgrace into a national spectacle. And at the center of it all stood Eleanor Ashford, the woman who had brought the truth into the light. What had begun as a discreet investigation into political corruption had unraveled into something far greater. The truth had been ugly, but it had been necessary. And now, with the storm finally behind her, she could breathe. It had ended with a lifeless body, sprawled across an opulent Turkish carpet, the scent of expensive cologne still lingering in the air, and a legacy shattered beyond repair. The Hawthorne estate, once a bastion of power and influence, had become nothing more than a mausoleum of whispered scandals and irreparable disgrace. Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, once the unshakable pillar of high society, had all but vanished from public view, retreating into the grand empty halls of her crumbling estate, a prisoner of her own past. Captain Hargrove had left London under the cover of night, his once proud stature diminished by the weight of his conscience, his footsteps leading him to the desolate cliffs of Cornwall, where he faded into obscurity. Inspector Caldwell, whose name now echoed in the papers alongside words like brilliant and relentless, remained unsatisfied, because he knew, as did the others, that the true game was far from over. Somewhere beyond the confines of this case, in the shadows of Parliament offices and exclusive clubs, the real masterminds remained untouched, their hands clean despite the blood that had been spilled on their behalf. But there was one person who saw the invisible thread still waiting to be unraveled. Miss Beatrice Alden, who had returned to her quiet cottage in Bramblewood, now sat in the dappled shade of her ivy-laced veranda, pruning the delicate white roses that bordered her garden. The case had ended, but its echoes lingered, whispers in the wind, unfinished business buried beneath layers of deception. The papers that Eleanor Hastings had uncovered spoke of deeper schemes, of men whose influence reached far beyond the gilded halls of the Hawthorne estate, men who had orchestrated it all from the safety of their hidden parlors. Miss Alden understood that justice, much like the slow growth of a rose, required patience. It would take time, but the truth had a way of unstoppable as the tide against the cliffs. She set down her shears, brushing the remnants of earth from her fingers, and reached for her cup of Earl Grey. A lone sparrow darted past the stone archway of her garden, its wings catching the last golden light of dusk. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a clock chimed, and as she sipped her tea, ever watchful, ever patient, she allowed herself a quiet, knowing smile. Because secrets, no matter how carefully buried, always had a way of coming to light, and that, she thought, was enough for now.